Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready?
All right, welcome to today's session. My name is Sammy Kaluru. I'll be hosting Rex Black. Rex Black don't need any introduction. I have privilege to knowing him for almost a decade now through my involvement with ISTQB as well as a training partner here in North America. Rex Black has over 35 years of experience. He is the president of the RBCS, a leader in the hardware, software testing. Rex RBCS has delivered consulting, test services, and training to hundreds of clients worldwide. Rex is the founder and also past president of the ISTQB and also the ASTQB in ISTQB in America. He's also co-founder and the past president of the TMMi America chapter, the organization that is hosting this conference. Rex is also most prolific author in the field of software testing. He has published over 14 books and has sold over thousands of copies around the world. And most of his books has been translated into dozens of languages. And without any ado, Rex, here you go.
Thanks, Sammy. Let me get my screen shared here so that everybody can see my presentation. All right, hopefully that's working for everybody. So yeah, thanks again, Sammy. Thank you to TMMi America for giving me this opportunity to talk to everybody today. And what I'm going to talk about is the intersection between DevOps and testing and TMMi. Particularly the synergies that we find moving into TMMi levels 4 and 5. So I'm going to look at those in some detail and give you some thoughts. Now, you might be looking at this diagram and thinking, you know, what is this? Well, I'm going to explain what it is here as we go. It's very important and central to DevOps and TMMi at levels 4 and 5. And we really need to start thinking about reorganizing the way we think about testing to focus on the two arrows here, the green one and the red one. So if you look at the TMMi model, levels 2 and 3 really are just basic testing best practices. They're not, they're applicable really to any kind of life cycle. They don't, you know, have any unique aspects to them life cycle wise. That also means that from a point of view of DevOps, there's not really anything DevOps-y about levels 2 and 3. It's just, you know, get your act together with regard to software testing. Well, when we get into levels 4 and 5, those ultimately are all about two things: finding defects as early as possible, as close to the point of introduction as possible, and preventing defects wherever possible. And that's basically shift left and shift down, which is what the diagram was on the opening slide. So shift left means find and remove defects as close as possible to the point of introduction. And shift down means, how about we put fewer defects in to begin with? And this is really, if you think about what you're trying to accomplish with DevOps from a product quality point of view and from a testing point of view, that's what we're trying to do. So let's look at how that happens. Now, first off, what is DevOps anyway? Well, for the last 20 or so years, you've seen things like Agile and the importation of lean manufacturing concepts into software development, Kanban, another import from Japanese manufacturing, hence the name, and specifically Toyota. And supercharging all of this has been the open source movement. So there are a huge amount of tools, and even if you're working in fairly obscure environments, you can often find tools to enable DevOps-y kinds of situations. So for example, I'm working with a client right now that is using SAP and PeopleSoft and a low-code development environment called OutSystems. And while there certainly are some limitations on the open source and other types of tools available to support DevOps types of activities, they're there. I remember once about 10 years ago, I was doing an assessment with a client that was using SAP, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we can't do unit testing because SAP." And I'm like, go on the internet, and 15 seconds later, it's like, no, ABAP unit. So there's lots of stuff out there, but it can be a little confusing because there's a lot of buzzwords and a lot of people kind of profiting from the buzzwords. So let's unbuzz the buzzwords a little bit. So we talked about shift left, right? Find and remove defects as close as possible to the point of introduction. Shift down is use root cause analysis, process optimization, and see if you can reduce the number of defects that are being introduced to begin with. And then we have continuous integration and continuous delivery. So this is where we have development, testing, all mushed together in a build pipeline of some kind or another that allows us to check in code as it's being done. And out of the other end of that pipeline comes not only a testable build, but a tested build, meaning that static analysis and unit testing and possibly some amount of automated system testing has been performed against the build already, which is, of course, shifting left. Now, continuous deployment takes that a step further and says, well, not only are we going to have a CI/CD pipeline, but we're actually going to try to push stuff into production more frequently. Now, what does more frequently mean? Well, it depends from one organization to another. Some organizations are famous for releasing multiple times a day. For other of my clients, it's more like, well, we want to go from once a month to once every 2 weeks, and that would be a step forward. So it can mean different things at different places. And so DevOps and DevSecOps basically, it's a compound word, dev and ops, and dev development and security and operations. So it is about primarily collaboration and trying to accelerate release and reduce siloing, getting people to work together. So with the buzzwords hopefully debuzzed a little bit, going back to a point I was making before, what we want with DevOps is automation. That's why all this open source is out there. It's automating, and it's not just automating testing, but it's automating a lot of things that have to do with quality and configuration management and releasing and deployment, et cetera, et cetera. So let's look now at how this all makes sense in the TMMi world. So if you look at TMMi closely and study it for a while, something will emerge to you gradually. Now it's hard at first because the framework is long. It's got a lot of detail in it. You got processes and sub-processes, and it's very, very specific. But when you step back from that and start to think abstractly, right? Levels 2 and 3, as I said, are just basic software testing best practices. Levels 4 and 5 get to the point where you're saying, well, look, we need testing to be fully integrated into all aspects of quality and all lifecycle activities, both static activities like reviews and static analysis, and dynamic activities, unit test, component integration test, system integration test, UAT, right? All those things need to be integrated together. No more silos. And we also want to move from a place of being, say, somewhat subjective, if you will, or potentially subjective about how effective and efficient the organization is, to really getting metrics around that. So we want to be able to measure process capability. We want to be able to measure project progress. We want to be able to measure team productivity. We want to be able to measure product quality, both functional and non-functional. So we really want to get into a place where we are making objective measurements and using those measurements to improve. So constant optimization of testing, constant optimization of development, security, of operations. So this is what fully realized TMMi level 5 would look like. So from a testing point of view, we are embedding into the DevOps processes. Again, no silos. We want to be embedded within the other activities that are going on. Our testing work, testing processes, want to be holistic in our thinking about it. We want to make sure that we know what we're doing. It's clearly defined. It's universal. It's unified across the organization, allowing, of course, for tailoring where essential. As I said, we're measuring it, and we're using those measurements to become more effective and efficient. We're using measurements that are statistically valid. So we're careful to make sure that we are using numbers that are actually meaningful and that they're balanced. Not going to get into metrics, but those of you who know me know that this is a big area of interest for me. And so if you're curious about metrics, you can go check out the RBCS YouTube channel. I've got lots to say about it, but we're using good metrics, and we're using metrics in service of shifting our approach from defect detection to early defect detection and defect prevention. So we want to start to think about testing as system testing, certainly, and UAT, most certainly, as almost entirely about confidence building and only incidentally about defect detection. And that, of course, is completely different than the way things are often done. Often testing groups are off in their own silo, and the main focus is on find as many defects as possible. And that's not good in because that's going to, if organizations respond to the way they're measured. So if we're basically telling people the value of the testing operation is determined by the amount of bugs they find, well, then it's not in the testing organization's best interest to shift left and shift down. So we want to try to move away from that and watch out for any sort of impediments like, bad metrics, bad bonus structures, those sort of things that are going to drive incorrect behaviors. As I said, we want to leverage automation as much as possible. you need to, of course, move there in a incremental fashion. There are a lot of tools out there, and if you just try to do everything all at once, it's going to be pretty much a disaster. So stepwise, deliberate progress towards high degree of automation, and making sure that, again, we remain aligned with industry best practices, both from a testing point of view and from DevOps and DevSecOps point of view. So again, fully integrated into testing is fully integrated into development, into security, into operations, that these things are working together. So what I've done in this presentation was we go through each of the 6 process areas associated with levels 4 and 5, is to talk about them generally as defined in the TMMi framework, and then to get into the DevOps angles. So let's look at each one of those. All right, so 4.1, process area 4.1, and test measurement. So this is about, upping our game from a measurement point of view. We want to look at effectiveness and efficiency. I often throw satisfaction into that mix too, the stakeholder satisfaction, because you can be effective and efficient, but your stakeholders can be dissatisfied, and that's not good. So we want to be measuring, how well do we do what we do? That's effectiveness. How well do we do that within time and resource constraints? That's efficiency. And how happy are our stakeholders with the work that we're doing? That's satisfaction. So we want to make sure that we're measuring those. We're measuring those for processes. We're measuring those for people. Because again, we have to be very careful with people metrics. We're measuring product quality, how well we're delivering product quality, and we're measuring how we're doing in terms of process improvement. Now, it's very important that these measurements be aligned with what management actually needs from an informational point of view. And so in a minute, I'm going to get into, what can we do to ensure that. There are 2 specific goals that are defined at this process area, 4.1 process area. Align the test measurements and analysis activities. And in this case, that would be alignment not only internally within testing, but also from a point of view of consistency across the development, the security, the operations point of view. And then, of course, providing the test measurement results. So we're talking about things like product dashboards and project progress dashboards and process capability metrics and so forth. So to connect this fully to DevOps, what we want to do is say, okay, we don't want to just look at test measurement, right? So that's the title of process area 4.1 is test measurement. We want to say, pull the lens back here, and let's say, what are we doing measurement wise for development? What are we doing for security? What are we doing for operations? What are we doing for testing? And how are those all aligned? How do we make sure that we're measuring in a way that is providing the full picture and is providing a consistent picture across those areas? Now, how do you do that? Well, you do that by looking at your strategic objectives and your tactical objectives. And then, so start with those. Start with what are we trying to accomplish for the business? And then what are we trying to accomplish within each group to support what we're trying to accomplish for the business? And then you use things like goal, question, metric to make sure that you're measuring against the objectives. And that closes the loop with what I was saying before, aligning measurement with management information needs. Management needs to know we're achieving our strategic and tactical objectives. And by creating metrics that are directly traceable to those objectives, then we're able to go forward with that. Now, the purpose of these metrics, of course, is to drive improvements. So that's going to lead us on into process area 4.2, which is the product quality evaluation. So the short explanation of that, paraphrasing and summarizing the framework, is that we want to have a quantitative understanding of our product quality. So not just like, yeah, people think it's good. And yeah, we survey our customers and they seem to be pretty kind of happy most of the time, except when they're not. No, that's not what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do is to say we have targets for what product quality should be. Those are our goals, and we know how to measure against using the metrics that we developed in process area 4.1. And we are going to do this specifically through two goals. One is we are going to have measurable and prioritized project goals for product quality. So we know what good looks like, and we have measurements that allow us to measure and say whether we're doing that, whether we're achieving that. And so with that goal set, we can actually quantify and manage the progress towards hitting those goals. Because again, it's quantified, right? We know where we want to be. That's the goal. We know where we are. We know what the gap is. And we can say, okay, we want to reduce that gap by X amount. For example, we might have, from a testing point of view and overall development point of view, operations point of view, we might say, okay, we currently have a defect removal effectiveness of 90%. Let's say we've got a defect detection effectiveness of 95% in our system and system integration testing group, a defect removal effectiveness of 90% overall. So we want to actually close that gap, and we want to get to the point where every real honest to God defect, which is found by system test, system integration test, will be removed. So we want DRE, defect removal effectiveness, to be equal to defect detection effectiveness, DDE, 90, and hit that 95% as an example. So basically, from a DevOps point of view, what we're doing is we're taking the metrics that we put in place in 4.1, the previous process area, and we're saying, okay, we've got objectives that are associated with product quality. We've got metrics, and we are now going to, as I said, make progress in those to improve. So as an example, looking at coverage, code coverage is a thing that I've done with a client recently. We had a fully integrated code coverage measurement that could measure code coverage at all levels, both manual and automated. And we wanted to set targets for, to what extent have we thoroughly exercised the software, and use that to make decisions about, are we, ready for release? Now, another thing to do here from a DevOps point of view, and this really kind of gets into Agile, is when you are talking about definition of done, make sure that test coverage and test results are part of that. There can be pushback on this. I run into this with clients. They're like, oh, well, the developers think it's not going to be fair if their, definition of done is, includes test coverage and test results. And it's like, well, how is that going to be not fair to them, right? And why would they be concerned about whether it was quote unquote fair? Right, because what that tells me when I hear that is that there is some sort of explicit or implicit reward / punishment associated with how much a developer gets done. And that's going to create problems. That's an example of a metric sending the wrong message, right? So what we're concerned about here is not how quickly can the developer throw something over a fence into the next step, right? That's waterfall thinking. That's shift right thinking. What we're concerned with is how quickly can the team as a whole deliver quality products into operations. All right. So make sure you're keenly attuned to any signs that somebody might be thinking about these things the wrong way, or that management through implicit or explicit metrics are sending counterproductive messages. All right, so 4.3 is advanced review. So this is where we get into, hey, let's make sure that we're thinking about the static part of the testing operation, static tests. So reviews are something that happen in levels 2 and 3 for sure. But what we're talking about here is, well, let's actually start using the reviews to measure product quality and set some targets for product quality early. And make sure that we are thinking about how to align what we learn from static testing with our subsequent dynamic testing. So there are 3 goals: coordinating the static test approach with the dynamic approach. So that means getting into your strategy and making sure your strategy is comprehensive, covers static testing as well. Not a lot of clients do this very well, I have found, and because it's challenging. So something that, you know, needs work, because these things are often thought of as very different. Set measurements. So again, moving from a purely subjective, you know, hey, gee, we think this user story is probably ready for a developer to start coding against it. Well, no, let's get a little bit more quantitative about what that would mean. And think about when we are doing static testing, we're doing reviews, we're doing static analysis, how the results of that would influence our dynamic testing. So for example, if we think that a particular user story is very complex, we need to be thinking up front during the review process about a more thorough extent of testing for it. So of course, that then means maybe your backlog refinement should include doing things like test design. And I'm working with a client right now as an agile testing coach to help make sure that they are doing that. In fact, we were doing that just this morning. So from a DevOps point of view, we want to make sure we're talking about things like backlog refinement, other forms of reviews, and we're talking about static analysis of code, static analysis of other kinds of artifacts as well. Again, make sure that, you know, the coverage is being, your dynamic test coverage is being adjusted based on what you've learned from your backlog refinement, other reviews. And for your static code analysis, what I've seen clients do, and I think this is a good practice, is you have both what are called soft limits and hard limits on when code can be checked in. So a hard limit basically says you can't check in code that violates these rules. A softer limit would say you can check it in, but there are going to be warnings. So you want to make sure that those kind of quality bars are being set. So that gets us through level 4. So moving into level 5, now we get explicitly into process area 5.1 defect prevention. So that is shift down. So we want to start looking at, why are we having defects? What could we do to try to prevent those from occurring? Now, this is nothing new. This goes way back, of course, you know, statistical quality control concept, but you know, it is definitely something that demonstrates a high degree of maturity of an organization, I guess you could say, when they're doing it. Now, I did some consulting work with Dell, and have done on and off for over 25 years. And one of the things that Dell has is a very good, what they call closed loop corrective action process. And so that involves looking at defects that have happened in the field, and then using the information gleaned from that to make process changes that actually reduce the incidence of those defects. So that's, you know, specific goals 1 and 2 right there, right? So DevOps, from a DevOps point of view, you know, using that root cause analysis, look for corrective and preventive actions, applying, you know, as you would Pareto analysis to make sure that you're focusing on the most important things, not because you're not going to be able to fix everything, and you're not going to be able to prevent every defect. Certainly as part of your agile retrospectives, you know, you should be thinking about when you found defects late in a sprint, why did we find that so late? What was the earliest possible opportunity to find and remove that defect? So want to really take a holistic view, defects, wherever we find them at whatever point, all the way from, you know, a failure in the CI/CD pipeline to bugs that were reported by customers. Use that Pareto analysis technique to focus and aim for the highest value improvements. So process area 5.2 quality control is now starting to blend together some things that we've done and talked about. So we had our statistically valid metrics, and so now we're going to try to apply that to our processes. We have process capability metrics, so now we're going to say, okay, let's use those process capability metrics to make sure that we are very predictable, that we are very stable, that we're making the process work in such a way that quality is very consistent and high. And we want to also start looking at efficiency again, so optimizing how effective we are within certain resource constraints and limitations. So we're using concepts from statistical process control, Six Sigma, Lean, and so forth. This is where we get into the DevOps stuff to achieve specific goal 1. So statistically controlled process, and using statistical methods to think about how to test, applying statistics, for example, to your risk analysis and your risk-based testing. So to make sure that this is fully DevOps enabled, expand the scope, not just from testing, but all development, security, and operations processes. So, you know, we want to break down silos. We want to expand the scope of process area 5.2 to span those different groups. Again, applying statistical process control, Six Sigma, Lean, those sort of things to really make sure that we are controlling the entire development process. What we're doing here, of course, is leveraging things that we did in process area 4.1 and process area 4.2, right? We're also highly leveraging automation. This is the point where we want to have a highly automated, very reliable, very consistent build and delivery pipeline. It should just almost never break. And we want to, of course, have metrics that tell us that it doesn't and tell us what its capabilities are in terms of things like code coverage and so forth. So metrics should be presented to the right people at the right time. So you don't want the fire hose of numbers going at people. You want to use information radiators of various kinds to make sure that the right people are seeing the right information. So some of my clients like to use things like big screen TVs that are displaying the latest results of the static analysis, the automated unit testing, the automated integration testing, and the automated system testing that's getting run as part of the build process. And then last, but certainly not least, we have process area 5.3, it's the test process optimization. So we talked about defining strategic and tactical objectives and metrics for them. So now what we're going to do is we're going to turn around and say, okay, we are going to look at those metrics, and there's effectiveness metrics, efficiency metrics, satisfaction metrics, and we are going to figure out which of those objectives, if we were to improve our achievement of it, would be most impactful. So we're going to use, again, Pareto analysis to identify the processes that have the most potential value associated with improving them. We want to look at ways of bringing in even more technology that can support this, more automation, for example. And we want to make sure that to the extent that we are creating assets of various kinds, test automation assets, et cetera, that those are being reused appropriately. So we have 4 specific goals here. Figuring out which process to improve, figuring out what kind of technologies can support those improvements, then deploying those improvements, and making sure that we are leveraging the assets created by those improvements across the organization. So from a DevOps point of view, this all just builds on top of the other 5 process areas that we've talked about here. And again, we want to make sure that we're reusing assets cross-functionally. So to give you an example of that, one of my clients was doing a lot of great work with BDD, behavior-driven development, from purely requirements management and development side. So they had their user stories, and then they had their acceptance criteria for their user stories, and then they would expand those or elaborate those acceptance criteria into given when then statements in BDD. And that was all great. And they were using those insights in their, like I said, their requirements management and their development side, but it wasn't being used by testing group. So I worked with them to establish a end-to-end process whereby, first off, get the testers involved early. So make sure there's a tester involved in the development of these BDD statements, these behavior-driven development statements, the so-called gherkins. So you're thinking about this from a testability point of view, and then make sure that that is feeding into the automation pipeline. So they were in the process of automating. They had like 100,000 manual tests, and they were in the process of automating those. They were about to 30,000 automated tests when I wound down my engagement with them. And I said, hey, all those BDD statements ought to be flowing into your automation backlog, appropriately prioritized, and should eventually end up in your automated test suite. So that's an example of making sure that we have assets being reused cross-functionally. All right, so I'll wind up here, and then we'll get into Q&A. So hopefully you've seen through this discussion that if you look at the process areas and the goals associated with levels 4 and 5, that there's really strong intersection and support with what you're trying to accomplish with DevOps. And so this is a thing to really try to keep in mind. Levels 2 and 3, great. Those are it's the foundation, it's the preconditions for doing anything else, because optimizing a testing process that is not based on basic testing best practices is like trying to optimize a tricycle and expecting that you're going to win the Indy 500 with it. That's clearly not going to happen. So you want to make sure that your testing process is not it's not a tricycle, it's an actual race car. All right. And then when you get into levels 4 and 5, this is where you want to start thinking about a unified overarching strategy. It's really easy to silo. So many organizations have problems with siloing. In fact, I would say that the vast majority of organizations do, and very few don't have problems with siloing. Now, DevOps is supposed to help you think about breaking silos, but it's hard. And even in organizations that are getting into DevOps, there still can be a lot of siloing, including siloing, ironically, within the DevOps work. So you want to try to avoid that. Another thing is focus on the process areas and the specific and generic goals associated with the 6 process areas. The practices, the specific practices, the generic practices, and in the case of the specific practices, the specific sub-practices within TMMi framework, that of course, the bulk of the text in the framework is in the practices and the sub-practices. And that can lead people to think, oh, well, that's where the meat is, that's where the value is. But in fact, it's the goals that you're trying to achieve. The practices are in there as a means to an end. So you ought to really, again, stay focused on what you're trying to achieve. Don't get lost in the individual details. I know that's easy to say. The first few times I read the framework, my eyes were going around in circles, trying to just understand the basics of it, understand all the nuances. Once you've digested it and you do understand it, it's time to pop up to that higher level and start thinking about, what's this all about? What's this TMMi stuff all about? And, as I said, what it comes down to is levels 2 and 3 are your basic testing best practices, and levels 4 and 5, shift left and shift down. And if your organization is already doing DevOps, you want to make sure, since DevOps is also about shift left and shift down, that we're doing that in a coordinated way. All right. Sammy, do we have a few minutes to get into Q&A here? I think we have some questions, right?
Yeah. Yes, we do have a couple of questions. Yes, we have some minutes left.
Okay.
Okay, all right. So yes, thank you, Rex. It's really enlightening to know the relationship between the DevOps and the TMMi and the test management, including the shift left and shift right. So we have a few questions here. The first question is shift left. Does it mean we are talking only from a documentation point of view? Is there anything else we can consider for shift left?
Well, I mean, the important thing with shift left is just to keep in mind that our objective in shifting left is to detect and remove defects as close as possible to their point of introduction, right? And a defect can be introduced in a document, in a user story, for example, or an acceptance criteria for a user story, or even if you're using BDD for in a given when then statement associated with an acceptance criteria in a user story. So shift left would be, let's get those user stories, their acceptance criteria, and any other assets associated with them, like BDD statements or test designs, so forth, as good as possible before we start doing development from those. But there are defects that are introduced in the development process itself, of course, right? So coding defects, and this is where we want to have things like fully integrated static analysis tools like SonarQube, for example, very popular. There could be tools that look at code layout and code formatting to make that consistent. I'm familiar with some of those for Python, for example. Static analysis tools that look at complexity, cyclomatic complexity. I forget that SonarQube has one. It's a fundamental complexity or intellectual complexity. So there's a lot of different ways of evaluating the code from purely static point of view as part of your check-in process, as well as the development process, and of course the unit tests. So we want to make sure that the developers are exploiting those kind of static code analysis and unit test tools to detect and remove defects before they're even checked in from a build point of view. And so, yeah, it needs to be holistic. Shift left can't just mean I want to strive for perfect requirements and test designs before I start developing code. Because while there's certainly value in that, there are other places where defects are introduced into our systems that need to be addressed.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Rex, for that response. I have another question here. It's an elevator question, actually, I guess. How would you respond to an engineering leader who says TMMi works best for waterfall?
Well, I would say that if somebody's thinking that, they're probably making the mistake I was talking about just a few minutes ago, is that they're bogged down by focusing on the specific and generic practices that are defined in the framework, and not focusing on the overall objectives of the process area and the specific and generic goals associated with that process area. Because if you do that, if you were to take a version of the framework where you just deleted all of the practices and sub-practices from it and just read the descriptions of the process areas and the specific and generic goals associated with them, you would see that there's nothing waterfallish about that at all. In fact, a lot of the stuff that you would see there is very closely aligned with what organizations say they're trying to do from a DevOps point of view. And that's no surprise, because if you look at books by especially Boris Beiser, but also like Bill Hetzel, some of the sort of foundational texts of software testing from the 1980s, you will see that a lot of the stuff they're talking about there is like, oh yeah, we're doing that now, or at least we're finally moving into doing that, right? So especially when you get into levels 4 and 5, as I showed, that if you can look at those specific goals that are associated with those 6 process areas, and those map right into what you're trying to accomplish with DevOps. So this idea that there's something inherently waterfall about the TMMi model is just wrong. It's a matter of people getting lost in the practices and not focusing on the goals.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Rex. We are we are just a couple of minutes late. One last question. Maybe we have room for one question. Talking about DevOps, do you see a lot of DevOps team benefiting from leveraging TMMi?
Well,
and how? Yeah.
I not as many as should, to be honest with you. Now, I did just do an assessment for a client over the last couple of years that did involve looking at what they were doing from a level 4 and 5 point of view, as well as levels 2 and 3, and aligning that with what they were doing with their DevOps processes. And I told them that they really should focus on getting levels 4 and 5 in place, because they were building up their DevOps practices. And I said, now is the time to do levels 4 and 5, because if you do those together, as you're solidifying your DevOps practices, and then start thinking about how to get to levels 4 and 5 in TMMi. If you do those things together, it's going to be more efficient. If you have the DevOps stuff in place and then come back around and say, okay, now we want to try to get to TMMi levels 4 and 5, you're going to end up having some rework that you have to do. So really, it does make sense for organizations that are transforming to be more DevOps oriented to look at how to exploit TMMi, especially levels 4 and 5.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Rex. I think we have a couple more questions, but we're out of time. Yes, thank you, Rex, for your time today and for enlightening us about the DevOps and the TMMi and the test management in general. For all the participants, thank you for joining today's sessions. Please, there is more sessions lined up for you. Please pick your favorite sessions and we'll see you there. And also do not forget to meet our sponsors at the expo and the networking table. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rex. Thank you very much.